the Elbe line that decided Berlin. Patton was driving east like a man who could smell the finish line. His armored columns were rolling so fast that maps went out of date overnight. Then, at the very moment Berlin felt reachable, an order came down that sounded like betrayal: stop. Not slow down. Not wait for infantry. Stop at the Elbe. Inside Allied headquarters, officers argued over a question that still burns in memoirs and after-action reports. Why would you halt the most aggressive American army in Europe when the German capital, symbol, prize, and political leverage was still on the table? Because the truth is, the Elbe wasn't just a river. It was a boundary, military, diplomatic, and moral. And once it was drawn, Berlin's fate was essentially sealed. But then something even stranger happened. Some of the same commanders who said Berlin wasn't worth the casualties quietly celebrated when the Soviets took it, because it meant they wouldn't have to explain the cost. A document still debated today sits behind the decision: Allied agreements, Soviet promises, and intelligence estimates that made Berlin look like a trap. The true cost of the order wasn't only measured in American lives potentially saved. It was measured in what came after: the shape of occupied Europe, the start of the Cold War, and millions of people who would wake up behind a different kind of front line. So why did Eisenhower stop Patton at the Elbe, an order that allowed Stalin to take Berlin? Spring 1945, the war is won, but the peace isn't. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine, shattered what remained of German field armies in the West, and were racing into central Germany. The Third Reich was running on fragments, improvised units, Volkssturm militia, and scattered SS formations. Yet the battlefield was still deadly. German soldiers fought on because surrender was uncertain, because the regime demanded it, or because they feared Soviet captivity more than death. Cities became fortresses by habit, not logic. And every river line, Weser, Saale, Elbe, could still cost thousands if defended. Meanwhile, the coalition politics were tightening like a vice. The Western Allies and the Soviet Union were winning the same war, but planning two different post-war futures. The key problem was simple: whoever occupied territory first would have enormous leverage later. The race wasn't just to Berlin. It was to Germany's industrial heartland, to communications hubs, to POW camps, and to research sites. It was to seize documents, scientists, and key Nazi leaders before they disappeared, or before another ally claimed them. Eisenhower's headquarters had to think like a battlefield commander and like a coalition manager at the same time. That balancing act would decide where Americans stopped, where the British stopped, and where the Soviets began. The characters: Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, Churchill, Stalin. Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a battlefield tactician in the Patton mold. He was the coalition's center of gravity, organizer, negotiator, and the man tasked with keeping Americans, British, and Canadians moving in one direction without tearing each other apart. George S. Patton was the opposite kind of force, an operational gambler who believed speed could replace bloodshed. He also believed, with near-religious conviction, that the Soviets were not partners for long. According to some accounts, he wanted to go as far east as possible to limit Soviet gains. Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, was Patton's boss and often his break. Bradley was aggressive, but he worried about overextension and casualties for symbolic objectives. Winston Churchill, watching Europe's future take shape, was increasingly alarmed by Soviet expansion. He pushed hard for the Western Allies to get as far east as possible. Some historians argue Churchill wanted Berlin as political insurance. Joseph Stalin, meanwhile, had a simple, brutal clarity: Berlin was the trophy that would justify Soviet sacrifice. The Red Army had endured catastrophic losses. Taking Berlin was revenge, prestige, and bargaining power in one. And behind them stood the combined chiefs, diplomatic agreements, and a calendar: the faster Germany died, the faster the alliance's unity would dissolve. Before the halt, the Western drive and the temptation of Berlin. In March 1945, the Western Allies achieved what had seemed impossible months earlier: crossing the Rhine on a broad front. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen and the planned crossings like Operation Plunder opened Germany's interior. Patton's Third Army surged across the Rhine and drove through central Germany. The U.S. armies took city after city, Frankfurt, Würzburg, Nuremberg, while pockets of German resistance crumbled. To soldiers on the ground, Berlin looked like a reachable finish line. The distance from American forward elements to Berlin narrowed quickly, and rumors spread through staff tents, "We're going to beat the Russians." But the high command saw a different map. Intelligence suggested Soviet forces were already positioned for a massive assault from the east. The Western Allies also faced the practical issue of supply. Armies ran on fuel, bridges, truck columns, and repaired rail lines. A dash to Berlin meant prioritizing one thrust at the risk of weakening others. There was also the Ruhr, Germany's industrial powerhouse, still full of German troops. Eisenhower believed encircling and destroying the Ruhr pocket would end organized resistance faster than a symbolic race. The plan, at least in Eisenhower's mind, was to finish the war efficiently, then occupy agreed zones. Berlin, he believed, was not the key to ending the fighting. The decision, Eisenhower's order, and the Elbe boundary. The critical moment came in April 1945 as Allied armies approached the Elbe River, the last major barrier before Berlin. Eisenhower made the decision that U.S. forces would not drive on Berlin. Instead, they would stop at the Elbe, link up with the Soviets, and focus on destroying remaining German forces and securing southern Germany. Why? First, Eisenhower calculated Berlin would be a costly street fight. Urban combat would grind armored advantages into rubble. Some estimates, varying by source, suggested tens of thousands of Allied casualties to take the city. Eisenhower believed those casualties wouldn't shorten the war enough to justify the cost. Second, the occupation zones had already been discussed among the Allies. Berlin itself was to be divided into sectors, but it lay deep inside the Soviet zone. Taking it wouldn't mean keeping it unless the Western Allies were willing to violate agreements or negotiate from a position that could spark crisis before the war even ended. Third, there was fear of friendly fire catastrophe. The battlefield was chaotic. If American forces pushed toward Berlin while the Red Army attacked from the east, the risk of accidental clashes was real. A single incident could spiral into a political disaster. And finally, Eisenhower's broader goal was to maintain alliance cohesion until Germany surrendered. He needed Soviet cooperation for the final defeat of Germany, and, crucially, for the war against Japan. Inside HQ, some called the decision pragmatic. Others called it surrendering the future. Immediate consequences: link up at the Elbe, Berlin burns. The order took effect on the ground as a hard stop. American commanders, including Patton, had to redirect energy away from Berlin. Units secured river crossings, established defensive positions, and prepared for the meeting with Soviet forces. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe near Torgau, an iconic moment, photographed and celebrated. For the public, it symbolized Allied unity and the closing trap around Hitler's Germany. But while hands were shaken at the river, Berlin was turning into an apocalypse. The Soviets launched their final assault with overwhelming artillery. Street by street, the Red Army fought through desperate German defense, SS units, and civilians caught in the collapse. In the West, the war ended faster in practical terms. With the Ruhr destroyed, German resistance in many areas disintegrated. American forces swept through southern Germany, Austria, and into Czechoslovakia, cutting off Alpine redoubts that some feared might become last-stand fortresses. The Western Allies achieved a clean operational finish. The Soviets paid for Berlin in blood and fire. The price: political fallout and the human cost. Eisenhower's defenders argue the order saved American lives, possibly tens of thousands. Berlin's defenders were fanatical, and the city's ruins would have been a death trap for infantry and tanks alike. But the decision also carried a long shadow. Because the Soviet capture of Berlin became a defining symbol of victory and a lever of influence. It helped legitimize Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe and shaped the psychological geography of the post-war world. The real cost wasn't only Berlin. It was what the Elbe line implied, acceptance that much of Central and Eastern Europe would be occupied by Soviet forces first, and that political outcomes there would be shaped under Soviet guns. Millions of displaced people, POWs, forced laborers, and civilians would find their fate determined by who arrived first. Western commanders did liberate many camps in their zones, but the rapid Soviet advance meant other areas fell under Soviet control, with consequences that lasted decades. This is where the Elbe becomes more than a river. It becomes a border in people's lives. Alternatives: could the Americans have taken Berlin? Could Patton, or any U.S. force, have taken Berlin first? Militarily, some historians argue yes. By mid-April, certain American units were closer to Berlin than some Soviet spearheads, and U.S. logistics were strong in the West. If Eisenhower had prioritized a single thrust, it might have been possible. But possible isn't the same as wise. Berlin was still about 100 miles beyond the Elbe for many formations, and German defenses could still concentrate in urban terrain. A push to Berlin would have required rerouting fuel, ammunition, and bridging units, robbing other fronts. It could have left flanks exposed and slowed the encirclement of remaining German armies. Then there's the political reality: even if U.S. troops entered Berlin, would they have stayed? The agreements in place implied the Western Allies would eventually withdraw from territories assigned to the Soviets, in exchange for Soviet withdrawal from areas assigned to the West. Holding Berlin without a broader renegotiation could have sparked an immediate showdown. Churchill was more willing to risk that confrontation. Eisenhower was not. And the United States government prioritized ending the war and stabilizing the alliance over a risky political gamble. Myths, disputes, and the documents behind the decision. A popular myth is that Eisenhower gave Berlin away out of naivety or even sympathy for the Soviets. Serious historians generally reject that framing. Eisenhower's decision was rooted in casualty estimates, operational priorities, and diplomatic commitments. Another disputed point: whether the Western Allies truly could have beaten the Soviets to Berlin if ordered. Some accounts suggest American reconnaissance elements could have reached the outskirts quickly, others emphasize the Germans still had coherent defenses and that the Soviets were already committed to a massive assault. There is also debate over how binding the occupation zone agreements were in early April 1945. One interpretation is that the lines were politically fixed and Eisenhower simply followed them. Another is that facts on the ground could have reshaped negotiations, meaning Berlin might have been a bargaining chip if seized. Memoirs complicate everything. Patton's writings, for example, can be blunt and political, but they reflect his genuine frustration. Churchill's later accounts emphasize his warnings about Soviet intentions. Eisenhower's own explanations stress coalition unity and avoiding unnecessary losses. The uncomfortable truth: everyone involved had reasons to defend their choice after the war ended. Conclusion: the river stop that became a world order. The hook question was simple: why stop Patton at the Elbe when Berlin was the prize? Because Eisenhower wasn't only fighting Germany. He was managing an alliance whose cracks were already widening. He chose certainty over symbolism, destroyed German armies, reduce casualties, and end the war cleanly, while trusting that diplomacy would handle the rest. But then history delivered its verdict in a different currency. The Elbe line became a preview of the Iron Curtain. Berlin became the stage where post-war rivalry would play out in concrete and barbed wire. And the decision meant that Stalin didn't just take a city, he took the narrative of final victory in Europe. Eisenhower's order may have saved American lives in April 1945. It may also have cost the West leverage for the next 40 years. And that's why stopping at the Elbe wasn't just a military choice. It was the moment a war ended, and another kind of conflict quietly began.